All right. Hello, everyone. Today, I want to talk about a study out of Finland from the University of Turku. And by the way, I seriously don't think I've ever seen as many incredibly inspiring promotional videos about a university as when I was looking for videos of people pronouncing Turku. If it's not obvious, I still don't know how to pronounce the name of this university. But I saw quite a few very impressively produced videos, and it seems like a thoroughly lovely place to go to school or grad school or whatever. But anyway, so the study is about the effects that early life stress experienced by fathers in particular may have on the brain development of their offspring. So, if your initial reaction is duh, obviously. A father who was traumatized in his childhood might have a unique influence on his children just through raising them, right? And that's a totally justifiable reaction. Frankly, that's usually my first reaction as well. But what makes this study intriguing to me is they're working with fathers who experienced early life stress, and they were imaging the brains of infants who were 2 to 5 weeks old. So if you've never been exposed to a human that's 2 to 5 weeks old, that's an age where humans have basically no business being outside of the womb, right? We're it's straight up potato phase, right? It's just sleep, rocking to sleep, pooping, and, eating, or, nursing, repeat, right? That's pretty much the experience of a 2 to 5 week old infant. There's essentially zero time for particularly meaningful observations of paternal behavior, parental behavior to occur. I mean, there's some, of course, but they're not really grasping what's going on. They can barely make any sense of their incoming sensory information. It's just sort of, barely even hooked up. So, the point is these are pretty young little humans that they're working with. So here's what they did. Oh, you know what? Why don't let's see, is it this one? Yeah, that's the study up there. So here's what they did. They worked with 180 infants in that 2 to 5 week range, and they excluded infants that experienced any kind of problems that can arise during birth or right after birth, and they had a whole series of criteria that they used to select for infants that didn't endure any of the kind of unfortunate consequences of the caprice of childbirth, right? Poor levels of oxygen, these types of things. So, born normally, essentially, or smoothly. So they were working with something called the Finn Brain Birth Cohort Study, okay? And this started in 2011 with the goal of exploring the effects of early life stress, including prenatal stress and parental stress and child brain development. So as a part of that whole Finn Brain effort, they collect info using the Trauma and Distress Scale, or TADS, and it includes information about 5 domains, okay? Emotional neglect, emotional abuse, physical neglect, physical abuse, and sexual abuse, okay? So this is how they get a sense of the early life experiences of, both the parents. And they also assess depressive symptoms in mothers, along with, body mass indices, levels of education, and just a bunch of stuff to get a sense of where the parents were, right, in their lives. And so, they used an imaging technique called diffusion tensor imaging, DTI, to get a sense of whether there's an effect of the father having some kind of early life stress on the development of white matter in his offspring. So about a week ago or so, I showed an example image of what DTI looks like, right? The images that it produces, that the platform produces, or at least what it can look like. So here's one. And so I use these images of the default mode network, which, you can see the sort of major nodes of the circuit in the brain. And this circuit is proposed to be this sort of dominant network that becomes active when we're just kind of zoning out, being introspective, thinking inwardly, and not focused on any immediate task or event in our environment. And so you can see the connections between those sort of yellow blobs, those yellow structures in the brain, as well as where they send projections, send signals throughout the brain. And so this is distinct from essentially all other neuroimaging technologies because it really focuses on the pathways between brain regions, right, rather than the anatomies of brain regions, like in an MRI, which you can see here, or second to second changes in blood flow, right, which you can see here. And this is an fMRI, right? So MRI on the top, fMRI. MRI gives you a sense of anatomy, and then fMRI gives you a sense of pretty rapid fluctuations in how much blood any given brain region is receiving, which is an indirect measure of how much activity is occurring in those brain regions. And so, in this one, for example, you can see usually the way the colors work out is that, red or orange, sort of hot colors, tend to be associated with increased activity, and then blue, colder colors tend to be associated with reduced activity in any given brain region. And so to give you a sense of what this can look like with a structure, what DTI can look like with a structure that's probably a bit more familiar to you, here's what DTI of the heart would look like. So this is a mouse heart down on the bottom here, just to be clear, but the mouse heart is really quite similar to the structure of the human heart. And so you can sort of see the structures of, the muscle fibers that compose the heart, and you can get a sense of like the directions in which they run relative to each other. So you can get a sense of like literally the muscle fiber structures of, of the heart in this case. And, of course, there are tons of other ways to image the brain, right? Things like CAT scans or PET scans. For example, but they're all sort of doing similar things. But DTI, which is again the technique that they use in this study, is different from them, right? So just qualitatively, right? Just call it. You can see like at a minimum, there's a kind of basic difference between these images, right? Anatomy and then pathways. And the pathways are also part of neuroanatomy, but just different components of that anatomy. And so, just this DTI image is stringier, right? It has a ton of lines, pointing in a ton of different directions, and you can see white matter in an MRI, which is what all of those various stringy lines that you see here would look like if, this DTI image were an MRI, right? A lot of particularly those green areas where there's really dense collections of fibers, they would appear white in an MRI. What DTI can show us is the general directionality of these pathways between neurons in different parts of the brain. And so the way it works is by, I guess I can leave that up. The way this works is by tracking how water molecules move throughout the brain, okay? Since all those connections between neurons, all those like lines, stretching out between those like yellow nuggets, are covered in super fatty material, water will tend to flow along those pathways rather than through them. And so, you can think of it sort of like this. Oh, you didn't see the MRI, did you? Oops. Oh, that's unfortunate. Here, why don't we do this? Nope. It is this. Yeah. Sorry, MRI, right? You can see the white matter. Sorry about that. Yeah. So MRI, you can see the white matter, and again, a lot of these stringy areas, but particularly like those green ones where there's just like bundles of them, those would appear white in an MRI, generally speaking. Okay, so let's go back to boop and nope, nope. Where did I put that one? Oh, it's this one. Yeah. Sorry about that. Bear with me. Late night last night. But so you can think of it like this, right? So again, water is flowing along these pathways because these pathways are literally covered in fat. And so you can think of it. You can simplify this quite a bit, simplified, but you can think of it sort of as what happens with water and oil, right? Imagine you fill a cup with water and then you pour some oil into the cup. You know what happens. The fluids separate. Olive oil is largely just fat, while water is water, and they're immiscible, right? They will not mix. So it's a similar concept here, right? Since the material that surrounds axons, myelin, which you can see here, conveniently labeled for us, myelin is essentially just like layers and layers of fat, right, that kind of wrap around an axon. An axon are those projections, those pathways between neurons. And so, those pathways are wrapped around in fat, and so water molecules can't really flow through those axons, right? Water has to flow along them. And so DTI exploits that sort of basic chemical interaction by tracking the movement of water throughout the brain. And since it'll tend to flow along these various connections, you can get a sense of like where those connections are by tracking how water is flowing. So, it's sort of like if you're interested to see, if you're interested to see like, in what areas an apartment or a house, have walls or furniture, right? But you don't have like a camera, that could just like literally show you everything you need to know about this home. You have to come up with some other indirect way to detect areas of higher traffic, right? One way might be to track where the greatest number of footprints are. Since people can't walk through walls, right, you can get a sense of like, the places that people tend to avoid by just knowing where people tend to walk. The areas they avoid are probably walls, probably furniture, or like solid things that they can't walk through. That's sort of what we're talking about when it comes to DTI, right? The parts of the brain through which water can flow can give you a sense of where the solid stuff is, right? And in this case, the solid stuff are the connections between neurons. And so that's what this group that wrote this paper was focused on when it came to the brains of the children that they were studying. They were exploring if early life stress, particularly in fathers, was associated with some kind of consistent effect on the brain development of neonates, or newborns. So out of that thin brain database, right, that database that I mentioned earlier, they found 72 trios. So specific, mothers, fathers, and infants, for whom they had information regarding early life stress experiences for both parents, as well as neuroimaging data from the infants very soon after birth, right? And so, for the early life stress, they specifically focused on the exposure to those stressors that happened before the age of 18, okay? So before adulthood. And so they noted that they, when they were doing this imaging, they protected the infant's ears, right, while doing the imaging, which is smart, of course. That said, I would love to have seen a video of like how exactly that went down, because they use both wax earplugs, the kind you just sort of mash in there, as well as earmuffs. And I know, the moment that I would have started fiddling with my daughter's ears, she would have tapped out like immediately. Like, no way was she going to work with this. So an interesting, observation. Anybody who has kids would probably sympathize. But so her father's, I assume she takes after me in that case. But so, at the time that the infants were born, the average age of the fathers was 31 years old. And then for the mothers, it was a bit over 30 years old, right? And then a bit over half of the infants were boys. And so, like a fairly reasonable sort of typical kind of situation for how births tend to go down and when they go down in the lives of parents, right? All right, so let's get to it. Here's what the group found. So the headline of this study is that there was a positive association between paternal early life stress and the effects on the connectivity of a handful of brain regions, in the infants. And specifically, in case you're interested in like the anatomical areas, again, the as I always say, the names of this anatomy, not particularly critical for you to remember anything, but in case you're interested, it was the right superior corona radiata, the left posterior retrolenticular parts of the internal capsule, and certain parts of the corpus callosum. And you can see in this figure, this is like probably the main figure, at least image figure that they had. You can see that they've highlighted those regions, in red, that were associated with paternal early life stress. And it's not a particularly sexy image. It's not as sexy as like the default mode network DTI image that I shared in the beginning, but it's not particularly important when it comes to the anatomical regions they're discussing, because they're like the major conduits of signaling throughout the brain. And so when I say conduits of signaling, what I mean are these are basically bundles of fibers, right? The connections between various parts of the brain, rather than focusing on one specific connection between like a single neuron and another neuron. These are large collections of connections. And so it's one way to think about this, it's sort of similar to the cables that actually transmit the vast majority of the internet internationally, something like 99% of it. Okay, so this is what they actually look like. And that's where they run, right? These bundles of fiber optic cables that run under the ocean sustain something like 99% of international communications in general. And in fact, this whole stream that I'm doing right now is probably blinking through some of those cables right now. It's kind of surreal to think about. But if you were to chop one of those cables in half, right? So here you can sort of see that. You'd see that these cables, this sort of nondescript cable, it's just a bundle of a bunch of fibers, right? Fiber optics. In other words, a fiber that's composed of a bunch of fibers. And so, when we're talking about these major neuronal pathways that this group, honed in on, they're focused on one of some of the major sort of like undersea bundles of fibers, right? Rather than just like a single fiber. Okay. Like another way to think about, this is like, it's the difference between like an alley that connects two bigger roads and an interstate highway, right? The alley enables some movement between nearby areas, not a huge distance, but you can get from one street to the other. But the interstate highways are significantly larger, and many, many more people travel using highways than do like a single alley, right? And so that's what we're talking about here. The regions that they've highlighted are some of the major highways of signaling in the brain that connect regions that are far apart from each other. And to the extent, or to extend this traffic metaphor, imagine the highway that's closest to you, particularly one where there tends to be quite a bit of traffic, right, at certain times during the day. And for me, at least when I was still driving to the office, it was I-95. Like clockwork, specific parts of the highway would clog up for no particular reason. Obviously there were like accidents sometimes, right, which isn't surprising, but like specific parts of the highway would predictably, literally 100% of the time, wind up bumper to bumper at certain times of the day. And like, I'm no traffic scientist, right? But I have to assume that's a byproduct of a bunch of factors. But at least one of them is that at a certain time during the day, too many people just need to use that highway, and it's just not big enough to accommodate all that traffic. So imagine that, for some reason, that area of I-95 or the highway closest to you just loses a lane or loses 2 lanes, right? It's a pretty significant change in the highway, and there'll be some pretty significant consequences on how easily people like me can travel, from one side of the bottleneck to the other. And so, on the flip side, imagine that we added 2 or 3 lanes to that area of the highway. All of a sudden, those predictable traffic jams would essentially disappear, and commutes would go from a bit over an hour to like just 20 minutes. So, this metaphor begins to break down pretty quickly in some pretty important ways, but, maybe most importantly because, signaling between different brain regions isn't exactly getting like bottlenecked. It's not like there are neurons in different parts of the brain that are like just dying to communicate with one another, but there's this anatomical bottleneck that's preventing them from doing so. Rather, it's more like there are parts of the brain that end up just being unable to interact as much as they normally would otherwise, right? Instead of there being an exacerbation of traffic jams, it's more like the highway was just always one lane, right? So people never even considered, traveling along that highway in the first place. Like me living in Philadelphia, wouldn't have even considered trying to work where I do in New Jersey. It just wouldn't have been an option, right? It wouldn't have even come up. That part of New Jersey never would have interacted with me, and I never would have interacted with that part of New Jersey. And so, right, traffic metaphor jettisoned in just a second, but that's the implication of what we're talking about in this study, right? If the brain of a developing infant, if certain major pathways in the brain of a developing infant are affected, right? So in specific ways, like connectivity will therefore, be consistently different. It'll have long-lasting ramifications for how that infant, right, responds to its environment, along with how it develops, its inherent behavioral, cognitive, and psychological predispositions, right? It just fundamentally changes the trajectory of the development of that infant brain if like some of these major fiber bundles are, mitigated or attenuated. And so, this group found that there were pretty significant associations between paternal early life stress and the development of the white matter tracts in infants. And, importantly, like they explored and controlled for, maternal early life stress, along with like all those issues that can arise, during birth that I brought up before. And so one of the brain regions that they highlight, a specific region of the corpus callosum, the GNU, it's one of the earliest fiber tracts to develop in infants. And, of course, since the corpus callosum, it's basically like a fiber highway, or a fiber that's a bundle of fibers, right? The method that they use, DTI, is pretty much the perfect one to detect, differences in the anatomies of this, particular brain region. And just to give you a sense of some of the anatomy that they've brought up, we're talking about that sort of anterior part of the corpus callosum, the sort of front part, that like bend area, that's the GNU. And that's, where they particularly honed in on it as being, affected by paternal early life stress. So, what they found was a little bit more complicated than just differences in size, right? They found that, like, this group found that the corpus callosa, or the GNU, particularly the GNU of the corpus callosum, but different parts of the brain as well, seem to mature more rapidly in the infants that whose fathers experienced some early life stress. It was like their corpus callosum was getting older faster than normal, right? Or in the absence of a father who experienced some kind of early life stress. And so, this group didn't get into like what the implications of having a more rapidly maturing corpus callosum might be, for these developing infants. That they would have to like follow the lives of like, these over 70 children to see how they grow up, behaviorally, cognitively, and psychologically, to get a sense of whether there's, a meaningful relationship between this consistent effect of early life stress in fathers and the unusually rapidly developing corpus callosum of their children, along with the other brain regions that they highlighted that I brought up earlier. And they also have no idea like how this influence on brain development, of these stressed fathers' children comes about. Could it just be purely behavioral, right? Like fathers just tend to be, more high strung maybe if they experience some kind of early life trauma, early life stress, and then they're just high strung, in the birthing room, right? When, from the moment that the infant is born to the moment they get home, they're, perhaps just having a more high strung father has, anatomical ramifications. Or could it be epigenetic? Like, could those stressful experiences that occurred early on in the father's lives end up modifying the epigenomes of their sperm cells? And so the data from this particular study, they don't really shed light on that question, right? But what this study does show us is that there does seem to be some relationship between early life experiences, particularly stressful experiences, in fathers and the development of the brains of their children. And so I'm sort of teasing a topic here, the topic of there being like epigenetic changes in sperm cells of fathers that occur as a result of some kind of life experience, not exclusively a stressful or traumatic one, but just life experiences. It's a controversial topic if you think about it, right? The human genome, your genome, approximately 20,000 genes, it doesn't really change throughout your life. You inherited the genes that you have from your parents. Every cell in your body is largely the byproduct of those genes, some pattern of those genes being activated, expressed at specific times. You inherited those genes, and unless you're exposed to some kind of like, environmental mutagen, right, that causes like a change to the genetic, information of one of your body's cells, causing it perhaps to become cancerous or just being destroyed by, your body's sort of surveillance systems, your immune system. In the absence of any kind of exposure to something like that, for example, if through smoking or being exposed to, certain kinds of pollution, radioactive materials, of course, too much exposure to ultraviolet radiation from the sun, all those types of things can modify the genomes of, specific cells, which then can potentially cause cancer. But, in the absence of that, your genome stays essentially the same throughout your life. It's immutable. But as you move through life and have experiences, experience stress, joy, horror, euphoria, love, hate, these types of brain states, your epigenome does change. And as the word implies, the epigenome is kind of like the collection of notes that influence how the genome is expressed, sort of like, the notes that you might take in like the margins of a book, or highlighting sentences on a page to draw your attention to that specific phrase on a whole, page of words. Epigenetic modifications to the genome influences if, when, and how much any given gene is expressed. And, when I started graduate school, it was still somewhat controversial to suggest that changes to a person's epigenome might be transferred to a person's children. At this point, though, so in other words, transgenerational epigenetic modifications. But at this point, it's become fairly uncontroversial. It's called, transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And so, we absolutely can't know whether transgenerational epigenetic inheritance explains what this group in Finland observed, right? But it's certainly totally possible and plausible, right? It's a totally plausible mechanism by which this kind of anatomical ramification of a father's early life stress might come about. But at some point in the future, I think it'll be worth exploring. The evidence that epigenetic changes that somebody experiences can be transferred to their children. It's spooky stuff. So one of the best review articles on this topic, by the way, if you're interested, was written by, and I'll add it to the description below. I forgot to include that one. Of course, link to this study is in the description below. But This review article was written by a professor who was at the University of Pennsylvania while I was in grad school there, Dr. Tracy Bale, who's now at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, which is a world-class, fabulous institution. And she's an absolute powerhouse, by the way, brilliant and inspiring and just ambitious. And, so if you or anyone you know is interested in epigenetics or biomedical research in general, she'd be a fabulous mentor. You're interested in living in this sort of part of the country. But one of the more controversial and stunning and kind of baffling results that we've seen in just the past few years in this whole transgenerational, consequences of exposure to various environmental, stimuli is exposure to various drugs. So I will get into this research at some point in the future because it's pretty multifaceted and complicated. But several groups at this point, independent groups, have shown that changes in biology, right, that occur when an animal is exposed to a drug like nicotine can seem to be inherited by the animal's offspring, at least some of those changes. And so, of course, we all know that there are plenty of changes that occur in the body when we consume a drug. Right, the pleasant effects, of course, the potential toxicity of the effects of the drug on various organ systems, of course, the substance dependence that can develop as a result. But we're talking about changes to the epigenome that occur when an animal has consumed a drug in the past, before they've reproduced or gotten pregnant, right, or anything like that. But then these changes seem to be inherited by their offspring once they do reproduce, along with some behavioral consequences, like the offspring react in a unique way, right, to the same substance, despite never having been exposed to that substance themselves, the same substance that their parent had been exposed to, usually chronically, earlier in life, before they reproduced. The offspring seem to inherit some of those epigenetic modifications, and those are correlated with unique responses to the first time they're exposed to that same substance. Pretty crazy. And there are other sort of like spooky transgenerational epigenetic studies that show that it may be somehow possible that learned helplessness, which is kind of like a model of depression in animals, it seems to be capable of being transmitted transgenerationally via changes to the epigenome. And so, there are particularly spooky studies that seem to show that, like just one example is like when an animal is exposed to a specific odorant, right? Think something like peppermint, right? A very obvious, overt, strong odorant that's not usually encountered in the environment. When an animal is exposed to that, but every time they're exposed to it, they get a foot shock, or they're put in like a particularly unpleasant environment. It's very aversive, so they associate that aversion, that feeling of negative kind of mood states and so on, with that particular odorant, with that sensory experience. When they do reproduce, right, then their offspring seem to have an elevated fear response to that same odorant, despite never having been exposed to it themselves, right? So it's this goes even beyond like being exposed to a drug that has like direct pharmacological psychoactive effects. This is just sensory experiences being potentially transmitted transgenerationally, and at least associated with epigenetic changes. This is definitely very controversial, and there are plenty of very totally good faith but very vehement disagreements among leaders in the field in neuroscience and in genetics. And I actually saw a sort of debate between a very prominent neuroscientist named Eric Nestler and a major neuroscience, other prominent neuroscientist here at the University of Pennsylvania, who also, by the way, happened to be on my dissertation committee, named Julie Blendy. Both labs have produced some of the evidence for this whole transgenerational epigenetic transmission, particularly when it comes to exposure to certain drugs, and multiple drugs, not just nicotine, but nicotine, cocaine. I'm sure that they've done opioids by now. I know that somebody in Julie Blendy's lab was beginning to work on it. These are very, very difficult studies to do. But anyways, despite the fact that both of these labs have produced the evidence that support this whole model of transgenerational epigenetic transmission, both strongly disagreed on just how much of the transmission of these behaviors was epigenetic versus behavioral, like baby mice just sort of passively observing subtle behaviors by their parents that we can't really notice, but still influences the development of the babies. Totally possible. So we'll eventually discuss this whole line of research. And again, ultimately what this research is suggesting is that the various experiences you have, the trauma you experience or the lack thereof, the substances you ingest, the sleep you get or you don't get, your diet and food consumption or hunger, right? Your exercise, all of these things that the research suggests, they all not only have an effect on your own epigenetics, right, of course, but the epigenome that your child inherits as well. So a story for another day. It's a very complicated story, but it's totally possible that something like that could be occurring, given that we know it occurs, or at least we have very, very strong evidence to suggest that it occurs in other domains of biology. So perhaps, unusually elevated stressful experiences early in life, before a father is even an adult, has epigenetic consequences that are transmitted transgenerationally to their offspring. And those epigenetic changes result in modified neuroanatomy, which then, of course, what would the consequence of that be? As I said earlier, like, that child, the way that child's brain develops will be different, and so therefore that child's personality, that child's predispositions, susceptibilities to substance use disorders, or behavioral inhibition issues, right? Impulsivity, maybe something like ADHD, maybe psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia or perhaps even autism, right? All of these could potentially arise from these epigenetic changes that delivered to the baby by this father who was stressed early on in life. And it doesn't necessarily all need to be deleterious, right? It could be that these children tend to actually be a little bit more resilient, right? Maybe they have a blunted glucocorticoid response, stress response to an environmental stressor, and so therefore they're less likely to develop depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on, right? So it's not necessarily all bad. It could be an adaptive process, or it could not be. So we shall see. We'll keep our eyes open. What does that mean for a child's lifetime? Exactly. This sounds like birth control reason. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Betty. Birth control reason. Well, like I'm saying, it's not necessarily all bad. It could be, that early life, adversarial experiences or stressful experiences actually modify the development of the brain in such a way as they become more resilient to stress. And so, who knows, right? And we definitely, there's this thing called the, what is it? It's like there's a curve, right, that was proposed at the turn of last century, but was actually kind of validated, which basically shows human performance in general tends to follow what's called like an inverted U-shaped curve, where a little bit of challenge of environmental stress is not great, right? It doesn't cause a human to develop as much expertise or as much resilience to the emergence of subsequent stressful experiences. So if you imagine a U, upside down U, right, that's where you're here, and then the amount of stress, the magnitude of the stress increases as we go along here. So just a little bit, not very much improvement in performance. Moderate exposure in the middle, performance actually benefits, right? And we're talking about just sort of performance in general, human performance in general, competency and these types of things. So a little bit of stress is argued to be beneficial, but then over the top, crazy, abusive, horrifying, unusual, stressful experiences, then you come back on the other side of that inverted U, and that can become deleterious. And so there's this sort of like Goldilocks zone of how much adversity, how much stress, how many challenges a human has to endure. And so anyways, this might be one of the mechanisms by which the consequences, the biological consequences of those experiences may be transmitted transgenerationally. Okay, that's what I got for you today. Before there's something happening today, some major event. Let's go live. Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania, coming at you live from snowy Philadelphia. And by the way, just now on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, I talked about a study that suggests that early life stress, we're talking under the age of 18, in fathers, seems to be correlated with changes in the neurodevelopment, specifically the anatomical development of infants by the age of 2 to 5 weeks. So within super early stage. If you've never seen a 2 to 5 week old infant, they're potatoes. Like they don't really they have no business being outside the womb, right? They I think they call it like the fourth trimester, right? Where it's like, you know, we should have like what marsupials have, like one of those little pockets so that the baby doesn't have to like deal with gravity and not being in this aqueous environment anymore. So already at that stage, this group detected anatomical ramifications of early life stress. And when I'm saying early life stress, I'm not talking about having to take a final exam or something like that. We're talking about like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, these types of things. And so if you are interested in that topic, and then I also talked about epigenetics and potential mechanisms, oh jeez, I always do that, ways by which this might occur, biological ways. So it looks like we're connected. What's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there? Boothill? Boothill? I think I can hear you. Can you hear me? Looks like we're having some problems. Maybe try calling back in. Sorry about that. Hello, Deanna. Good to see you. DC Hooper, 91. She's a cosmologist. And she talks about the universe and stuff like that. So those existential questions, you can challenge her with those. Like, what came before the Big Bang? Pretty cool stuff. Okay, no CTE Super Bowl special. Yeah, I know. You know, I used to do that basically every year. So yeah, Boothill, it looks like we had a connectivity problem. So if you would like to call back in, and I used to live in Ontario, Canada. For a couple months, for like 4.5 months, I think. I lived in Ottawa. Beautiful, beautiful place. That Parliament building is gorgeous. Yeah, so I used to do a CTE thing every time that there was a Super Bowl, except for one year because the Eagles were in the Super Bowl. I don't really watch football, so I'm not like a huge devotee of the sport. But, you know, I just feel like I'm happy to talk about TBI if somebody wants to bring it up. But, you know, I don't want to be like a downer, you know, on like this is like a pseudo-religious holiday in the United States. But so let's see if we can connect here. Or are we having trouble? Looks like we're connected. What's your name and where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Asia, and I wanted to know about OCD. Like, I get OCD bouts, I don't know why.
So just OCD in general, like what it is and how it comes about?
Like my mind says, like, make me sick, God, and I say to God, no, please don't. Then my mind abuses God. Then I say, sorry, God, I didn't abuse you, and this goes on for like all day.
So you're saying like you experience guilt and you ruminate, you think that you've misbehaved in some way or violated your sort of spiritual guidelines, and you ruminate over that. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, and it's not permanent, but it goes on like a month, and then it goes off, and then it again goes on the next month.
Yeah, so that is, and you said you're calling from Asia?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That is definitely, you are right to hone in on OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. That is like a classic symptom of OCD. And, you know, the sort of technical term for it is perseveration, you know, think persevere, but rumination, you know, that is a classic symptom. And so, you know, there are a bunch of different brain regions that would be involved in that. But generally speaking, one of the sort of primary brain regions that is highlighted when it comes to OCD is the dorsal striatum, or the striatum in general, but the dorsal striatum in particular. This is a part of the brain. It's sort of towards the front, and it's involved in sort of behavioral execution, right? In selecting for specific behaviors. It's, you know, the ventral striatum is involved in reward. It's also involved in addiction, for example. But it's essentially a brain region that determines what we're going to do, right? What our actions will be, how decision making occurs. And so when it comes to rumination, you know, first of all, the human brain certainly evolved to be far more predisposed to sort of negative mood states and aversive mood states. You know, of course we can experience joy, but we just didn't evolve to just have this sort of constant level of joy and satisfaction. That would be evolutionarily pretty disadvantageous if you think about it, right? And so we're all sort of primed to experience these you know, periods of guilt, these periods of depression, sadness, and we all have some predisposition to rumination. But in certain cases, it seems that, and it's kind of similar in a way to addiction, in that you're aware that this process is irrational, or there's no justification for example, taking a drug, right? When you know that it's bad for you, or you know that it's negatively affecting your life, but you do it anyways because this brain region has been sort of co-opted and sort of manipulated into being driven to continue consuming the drug. When it comes to rumination, a similar type of process is going on, where one part of your brain is generating this negative mood state. And not just the striatum, other parts like the anterior cingulate cortex will be involved as well, for one reason or another, is focused and focused on that specific source of negative mood states. The reason that we have negative mood states is to motivate us to promote certain behaviors to mitigate that negative mood, right? It's the only reason we really have it. And so when it comes, and there's a whole process of selecting for focusing on those negative mood states. And so when it comes to obsessive compulsive disorder, there seems to be some biological mechanism, and I mean, there is a biological mechanism by which that process becomes amplified and it can become inescapable. And you say that there's a cyclical kind of component to it, that it seems to happen, once a month or it's sort of predictably monthly. There's a bunch of potential explanations for that. The simplest explanation from my perspective as a scientist, right, not as a physician, would be that in any given month we're likely to be exposed to something that causes stress, that causes negative emotional experiences that sort of freaks us out, right? And in some cases, right, for some people, that moment can precipitate, that experience can precipitate this whole process. And it could take a while to crawl out of it. And so, it could literally just be something in the environment just tends to trigger this rumination that you experience. And, you're off to the races. It could also be the fact that there's a bunch of cycles in our body, right? Hormonal cycles, signaling cycles in the brain, right? Like your circadian rhythm, for example, is a cycle. But, testosterone, glucocorticoids, all of these kind of hormones, thyroid, also follow cycles. And so it could be the case that for some people who don't necessarily have severe OCD but have OCD, tend to be triggered by certain points in that cycle. And so therefore, just predictably, for whatever reason, you'll think back to something that caused you guilt, caused you aversion, and because you have, let's just say, totally speculative, let's just say that it's glucocorticoids, right? And it's cortisol, right? And so for whatever reason, you have this elevated level of cortisol, and that triggers these regions of the brain to focus in on these negative mood states. And then because you may have some predisposition to OCD, you begin to ruminate over that. It could be, those things could be something completely different, but that's how I think about rumination when it comes to obsessive compulsive disorder.
Man, after the sex for like 1 month, it's really hyper, but after that it calms down. So I don't know what is the connection between sex and OCD.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, certainly, I mean, sex is one of the most primitive, one of the basic things that have been in humans for millions and, well, not humans, but primates for millions and millions of years. It's one of the sort of foundational experiences that sort of drives a lot of human behavior, human psychology. And so, yeah, and of course, when having sex, it's very, very gratifying, of course, viscerally gratifying. And, it is, obviously it's pleasurable, right? But so, as a result, yeah, I mean, certainly something like sex, but then also, these basic things like food, like one's relationship with food, or, these types of sort of visceral experiences, totally unsurprising that it would be involved. But yeah, I can't tell you for sure, of course. Hey, Haley, good to see you.
So what do you actually do, Sarah? doctor or something?
So I have a PhD, so I'm a scientist. But what you should do is go talk to a physician. There are people, psychiatrists, psychologists who specialize in something like obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a bunch of, and we may be barking up the wrong tree. They may decide that this is not actually obsessive compulsive disorder. Maybe they might even say you have a good reason for being, for feeling guilt on this, and they'll just focus on developing strategies for you to accommodate them. Or adapt, but that certainly, like if I was talking to somebody in my family, that's what I would suggest, is that they go talk to a physician who has some experience treating obsessive compulsive disorder. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for calling, and best of luck. Yeah. Sorry, that probably wasn't the most gratifying of responses, but I do well after a massage. I do too. Your brain and body react to the way you think. Well, yeah, your body certainly reacts to the way you think, but your brain, the way you think is a byproduct of what your brain is doing. Lol, I'm trolling. Yeah. Yeah, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely something to that kind of a model. Yeah. Hey, Diane. Hello, Haley. Fake A doctor. You're still a virgin. You're right. My daughter was born of immaculate conception. You are right about that. It is very interesting to me when somebody is trying to troll somebody and they focus on being a virgin. I think it reveals something very deep about somebody's insecurity if, like, the way they criticize somebody else, particularly men, is that they're virgins, that they haven't had sex. Like, why would that be offensive? Why would that speak to somebody's competence or somebody's, how the value that somebody has? I think what you're really revealing is that you are insecure about your own prowess, about your own sexual experiences. So, but hey, I'm just speculating here. Really enjoy your scopes. What are we going to do after March 31st, 2021? Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up, Fig Media. So the first is I've been streaming to YouTube. Usually what I do on YouTube is I pick a specific topic and I dive into that topic. Today, youtube.com/anthropoid. I have a link in my profile page that you can find there if you'd like. Today I talked about early life experiences in fathers, right, before the age of 18, causing anatomical changes in the development of the brains of infants. Infants 2 to 5 weeks old. So, I talked about that today, but then we do this sort of live conversation. But then there's also this new platform called HAPS, HAPPS.TV. You can also find the link to that in my profile page, and that's a platform that's a bit more like Periscope. It actually has a lot more tools in Periscope, though. So you can check those two out. Roy, good to talk to you again. Wait, where are you calling from again, Roy?
I'm calling from England in Dover, Wycliffe, Dover.
That's right. Awesome. Good to talk to you again. So what's on your mind?
Yeah, it's been a while. Bit of snow yet. I don't know what it's like over there.
Yes.
they're all singing Christmas carols in the street. The kids.
Yeah.
I just want to have a little chat to you. Do you know anything about nanotechnology?
A fair bit, mostly with regards to its applications in biomedical science. But what's on your mind?
Yeah, because I thought, like, with the scientific side of what you like, obviously that might bring. I don't know fully whether you would know so much about it, because it's very. Because I'm hearing reports like from doctors that they're putting nanotechnology into like medicines now. It's we don't get told all this stuff. I mean, until later on in life. I wonder whether you had any insight into that, Ian. Whether you've come across any of this.
So the term nanotechnology is it's sort of a frustratingly broad term. It can refer to a lot of different things. I think what comes to most of our minds first when we hear the word nanotechnology is tiny little robots, right? But that's actually not what. I think probably the majority of nanotechnology probably doesn't involve something like that. Although there are really amazing examples. Like one of the coolest example that I've seen is basically like a material. It's like this. I think might be graphene, but it's these little cubes. Imagine a piece of paper, and they sort of deposit certain compounds along certain areas, and the paper can basically move on its own in certain directions. Pretty cool. So like that counts as nanotechnology. But then also like, you know, the little lipid bubbles essentially that are being used for the mRNA vaccines for COVID-19 here in the United States, that also counts as nanotechnology. That, you know, nanolipid particles, right? Nanoparticles. So it's this very, very broad term. But when you say putting nanotechnology in medicines, what specifically are you referring to?
Well, what people are saying, and there's all sorts of things going on out there, is where there's like a silicon coat or something in that could be put in like medicines and vaccines, and so it could be traceable, so it could be like used as like DNA, like as a. But I mean, years ago, I guess my father would never dream of that we'd have an iPhone back in the day. So you know what I mean? It's obviously we don't think about this sort of stuff, like the TV when that was invented, and they even reckon when you watch the TV, there's things coming out the TV with the waves which are seductive, and you must have heard about all that as well.
Well, so when you're referring to putting like nanotech in vaccines, right? So that was one of the things that has been circulating quite a bit, and so you know there was like accusations that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or Bill Gates in particular, was putting, you know, some kind of nanotech in their vaccine so that they could track people. I definitely saw, you know, people claim that it was so that they could control people's minds. There's literally no evidence for that. And frankly, like, you don't need to do that to track if somebody's had a vaccine, right? You can just test for antibodies, right? You know, and there's definitely no technology out there that I've seen, right, published in scientific literature from leading labs from, you know, MIT or, you know, Cambridge and Oxford and so on, that are even close to having some kind of like intelligent nanotechnology that could be used in medications. Usually in medicine, when people are referring to nanotechnology, what they're referring to are, you know, complicated materials that behave in very, very targeted and like intentional ways. Like, for example, clearing out cholesterol plaques, right, throughout the vasculature, for, you know, to prevent a heart attack, for example, or you know, making pills that, you know, instead of just having some kind of complicated coating that dissolve in controlled ways when they go through the stomach acid and then through the intestines, rather having some kind of mechanism that at a certain moment can be triggered to open the medication. These types of things. You know, there's no evidence, and frankly, all of the sources that I've seen that claim that like there are, you know, there's nanotech, there's chips in vaccines, and there's chips in medicine. They're all coming from groups that like, or from individuals that don't seem to have any training in science, and are just generally adversarial to medicine in general, but certainly vaccines. But you know, are there any other more particular things that you're referring to, Roy?
Yeah, I think the thing is as well, everyone's a bit unsettling about the vaccine, what's in them, and everything like that, which is understandable.
Yeah.
Would you take this vaccine and give your little one the vaccine at this point at the moment? Would you be happy with that?
Wait, if I could just have a little of a vaccine?
No, would you, like, you know, like, it's probably going to get to the point where we all have to take the vaccine, right? Would you be happy with that, or do you think it should be a person's choice? Do you think you would take the vaccine?
I will, the moment that I can take any of the vaccines that are available, I will take that chance, or I will take that vaccine. And I don't care if it's the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, I don't care if it's the Novavax vaccine, I don't care if it's the Moderna or the Pfizer ones, and there are others as well, the Russian, what is it, like Sputniks or something like that. They have a vaccine that seems to be fairly effective as well. But like, yeah, absolutely. I haven't taken it yet, but that's just because I'm in a very low priority group. I might be able to take it a little bit sooner because of the nature of my work. But I'm young, pretty healthy. You know, my wife is young, pretty healthy. My daughter, blah, blah, blah. We don't live with anybody who's in any risk categories. And so I just haven't been prioritized. My parents have had their first vaccination dose. They took the Moderna one. I'm happy to talk about like how these different vaccines work, right? There are differences that are fairly meaningful, but like these vaccines are like shockingly effective like shockingly effective. And the side effects, you know, it's totally legitimate to be concerned about side effects of any medication, right? Totally legit. And, you know, there are, I think, good faith concerns about how rapidly these vaccines were produced and everything, but most of those concerns are based on a misunderstanding of how vaccines are typically made and how these were how these were expedited. And so, you know, but basically the side effects of these vaccines are like shockingly low. You know, some people, of course, react, of course. And, you know, it's not like you get the vaccine, you'll never even know you had it, right? You're going to have some reaction, right? But by and large, I mean, they're remarkably well tolerated. And so yes, absolutely. Now, when it comes to like mandating vaccines, that's sort of a different kind of conversation to have. It's definitely one that we're talking. I'm a science advisor to state government, and you know, it's certainly something that is discussed among legislators and stuff. That's more of a philosophical argument. I mean, of course, the biological argument, the medical argument, is that if we don't vaccinate enough people rapidly enough, we're going to get new variants of this virus, SARS coronavirus 2, COVID-19, because there'll just be more opportunities for mutations to occur. And eventually, as we've been seeing in South Africa, in the United Kingdom, I think in Kent, in Brazil, there's a bunch of different strains now. Fortunately, these vaccines seem to be pretty effective against them. But if we don't get enough people vaccinated rapidly enough, we're inevitably going to see a strain that is more aggressive and that evades the immune system response of these vaccines. So that's the medical argument. The philosophical argument, I think, is different. That it really comes down to what you think the relationship, the powers of a government should be over, human individual decision making, that's really not my call, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Well, thanks, Ian. It's been lovely talking to you again, and I'm glad you remember me.
I'm sorry?
I said, well, thanks for being really interested. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
I'm just saying thank you, and glad that you remember me.
Oh, of course. I wish I was able to visit Dover when I went to...
No, it's okay. It's okay. You did great. Thank you, Ian. Take care, buddy.
Thanks for calling, Roy. Talk to you again.
Bye.
Roy in Dover. Always lovely to talk to our friends across the Atlantic. Hey, Ian, great presentation of information. Oh, thank you, Frank. I wonder, since there are always... This is on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. I wonder if there always seems to be a struggle to find an all or nothing, X or Y answer, product of the process. Always seems to be a mix in the end. Indeed. Yeah, that is a very good instinct. Yeah, if you just want like a sort of like a useful reflex to trying to understand how any given phenomenon occurs, that certainly when it comes to human behavior, but in neuroscience. And the question is this genetic, or is this behavioral, or is this environmental? Is it nature, or is it nurture? If you want to be right about 99% of the time, the answer is it's a little bit of both. Generally speaking, it'll be a little bit more of one than the other, but when it comes to human behavior, these complicated things that we do, it's essentially always going to be a combination of both genetic and environmental experiences. But what's useful is when we can identify examples of when it is mostly genetics or when it is mostly behavioral. But yeah, by and large, when it comes to like human intelligence, personality, even the emergence of diseases, all these types of things, cognition, all these types of things are the byproduct of both the genes you inherit and therefore the architecture of the brain that you've inherited, largely the architecture that you've inherited, and then the environment into which to which you're exposed. Nice response to the trolls. Some learned and some transgenerational epigenetic. Yeah, inheritance. Exactly. Yeah. Even a chemical coding can be referred to as nanotechnology. Exactly. And anything that can mitigate this awful virus. Yeah. Listen, I think that there is this instinct that people in public health and in biomedical science have in their response to vaccine hesitancy, which is, rather high right now in, various parts of, at least the United States. I don't know about other countries. I believe that's also the case in the United Kingdom. I'm not sure about Canada and other countries, but in any case, I think that there is this instinct to be just completely shoot down that hesitancy and say it's complete nonsense, it's totally unjustified, it's just fear-mongering. And some... More often than not, when it comes to vaccines, that's true. But when it comes to these vaccines, I get it. Like I empathize with, just like having good faith questions about, what's unique about these new types of vaccines, what's unique about how they were produced. So I think it does folks a disservice. It's counterproductive to just pretend like you shouldn't even have these concerns. I mean, I had conversations with like Lena Wynn, I think is her name. She's like sort of a leading epidemiologist. Not conversation. She was on a panel about this, and there were legit questions about like how rapidly these vaccines were produced and everything like that. So yeah. I have a question. My mother-in-law died of Alzheimer's. Will they ever find a cure? Sorry to hear that, Carl. Will they ever find a cure? Yes. The answer to that is yes. Alzheimer's disease, the byproduct of biological processes, which are the byproduct of physics. Essentially, they all obey the laws of physics. Just as much as me picking up this book, relies on the laws of physics. Alzheimer's disease is no different. It's more complicated than just me picking up this book. And we're still in the process of unraveling all of the, or enumerating all of the dominoes in the cascade that falls that generates Alzheimer's disease, right? We're still in that process of understanding the initial causes. And we know some of the initial causes, like, for example, we know, and I talked about this last week when it comes to the relationship between Alzheimer's disease and COVID-19, that people with a particular form of a gene for a protein called ApoE, we know that if you inherit a certain form of that gene, you are significantly more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease and more likely to develop it more rapidly. And so, but that only explains a small cohort of Alzheimer's disease patients. There's clearly a whole other set of biochemical cascades that produces it. So, we're still in the process of learning all that. We know a lot about it. We know amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles are sort of like the signature of Alzheimer's disease. And we know a lot about how those plaques begin to form, how those aggregates begin to form. And we have some pretty good treatments for Alzheimer's disease, but they're largely palliative. They're not cures. They are palliative. They're not cures. And so, some really creative things have been attempted, like, for example, trying to get the immune system to help clear out those amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. These are things that build up, sort of like lint builds up in your pocket, right, from all the fibers of the cloth of the pocket sort of rubbing up against each other and breaking each other and then aggregating into those little lint balls. Similar type of thing happens with amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. Amyloid beta plaques outside of neurons, neurofibrillary tangles inside of neurons, just sort of, gunking up the abilities or the processes that occur both inside and outside of neurons, preventing their optimal functioning. We know a lot about that process. And so the question is going to be, it's going to take some kind of interesting, creative, approach to developing a therapeutic for Alzheimer's disease. And actually, there is a new treatment that was just FDA approved. A little controversial. What is it called again? I always forget. Aducanumab. Aducanumab is a new treatment that was, I think, just approved a couple weeks ago for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And it's a little controversial because not all of the trials have been particularly compelling. But in any case, new treatments are coming out. Alzheimer's disease is one of the most active domains of neuroscience research. I almost did my PhD on Alzheimer's disease, and the pathway that I was going to study, I think, might yield some interesting therapeutic candidates. I was studying the ubiquitin proteasome system, which is basically the system in most of our cells that is sort of like a maintenance crew, right? Where if there's some kind of a protein, something in the cell that is misbehaving, or it's old, or there's something wrong with it, it's not folded properly, there's something wrong with it. The ubiquitin proteasome system basically tags on these little flags, right? These little markers that then signal that protein, that cause that protein to go to another part of the cell called the proteasome, which then chops it up, gobbles it up, and basically breaks it up for parts. Proteasome with an E at the end. And there are other types of biochemical cascades that do very similar things, but it might be the case that if we could just come up with some kind of therapeutic to activate that cellular process, your own body would begin to clear away that amyloid beta plaque, those amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. That's just one example. But, it could be the case that we find more of the genetic causes of Alzheimer's disease. And so you'll know with far greater certainty far earlier on if you're likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. And then, therefore, potentially there could be treatments using something like CRISPR-Cas9 or something like that, or there could be viral treatments. There could be, you know, a virus that's generated that causes the expression of some kind of thing that prevents the aggregation specifically of amyloid beta plaques. There's a ton of potential approaches. And so I'll never apologize for misspelling anything in science. Believe me, you certainly shouldn't apologize to me, because I can barely, you know, spell anything in science. I'm impressed that you were that close to proteasome. But anyways, yeah. So, you know, it'll be a little while, unfortunately, before we're at that stage where we have really, truly effective cures for Alzheimer's disease. But we will get there, so long as we continue investing in basic science research, science that's done at universities, you know, just for the pursuit of knowledge, because we still don't know what we don't know. And until we, you know, continue to you know, add to the human fund of knowledge when it comes to neuroscience in general, genetics, and you know, the brain, you know, but if we so long as we continue investing in that sort of basic research, I have no doubt in my mind that yes, we will come up with cures, preventative treatments, and cures for Alzheimer's disease. Okay, where's my thing? Let's see. Sorry, folks. Let's see. Sorry. Okay. All right. So, and I'm sorry to hear about your mother. Alzheimer's disease or dementia runs in my family as well. It's devastating. In fact, you know, I honestly think dementia is just one of the most devastating illnesses that one can develop, because there's no obvious sign. You know, it's not, the person still looks the same, right? They haven't lost a limb, right? They don't have a burn somewhere in their body, right? They're not, you know, overtly damaged or visibly damaged. But what deteriorates is like who they are and their ability to even remember you and their personality. They can become far more agitated. And it's not only devastating, of course, for the person suffering from the condition, of course, but it's devastating for everybody around them, right? It's pernicious. It's, you know, it's just awful. And that was frankly one of the reasons that I decided not to go into Alzheimer's research. It's just, first of all, because it's very, very difficult, obviously, but also it can be devastating. And so I studied addiction instead. But it was a really hard time. Yeah, I can imagine. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, we are all victims of entropy. Yeah, that's pretty true. You know, that's fair. Do people have no instincts, reflexes only? You know, that's an interesting way to bring that up. I mean, I don't think it would be accurate to suggest that humans have no instincts. I think it just depends on how we're defining instincts. So if you're defining instincts as, you know, essentially processes that occur in the brain subconsciously that you don't really follow, you don't really like intervene, you don't actively consciously interrogate, they just sort of happen. That's how I would define instinct, right? But those can come about both, let's say, by nurture and by nature, right? Both by nature, by the genes that you've inherited, the neuronal architecture that you inherit from your parents, like literally the anatomy, the collections of neurons, where they are relative to one another and how they're connected to one another. But then also from nurture, from the environment, right? So let's say, you know, you have grown up in a city, right? Like a dense city like Philadelphia. And, you know, you spend time walking through areas that maybe are a little bit more dangerous, a little bit more crime there, and they have a certain appearance, they have alleyways, they have a lot of shadowy places, right? And you learn that, you know, that generally speaking, environments that look like this, in those environments, I'm at a greater risk of some kind of threat to my survival, my well-being. And then you go to a completely new city, you still experience that sort of low hum of this, there's potentially danger here. You're not like consciously saying there are alleys around me and so therefore, you know, I might be mugged or something like that. It's just this sense, this kind of this subconscious, unconscious sense. I would call that an instinct. But if you're calling instincts like, you know, the ability of certain animals to just walk right when they're born, right? Humans are not born that way. Then that's different. Then, you know, one could say yes. I mean, then humans don't. But, you know, I think I would refer to that as something closer to reflexes. And obviously humans do have reflexes. Like, for example, the pain withdrawal reflex, where when you step on a Lego, like I tend to do a lot these days because I have a 2-year-old daughter, that, bright pain, that severe pain that you experience almost immediately causes you to withdraw your leg, right? That whole process completely doesn't involve the brain at all, right? That is completely mediated by the spinal cord. And so that is a reflex. And so, I think that there's a meaningful distinction between those two things. And yeah, I think that humans, do have instincts. Like, another one. Humans, it seems to be the case that certain sort of shapes in the environment can cause certain reactions, right? To give you an example, and we're just talking in generalities here. But we have regions of the visual cortex that are devoted, clusters of neurons that are devoted to responding to specific shapes, right? The shape can be, a straight line. Shape can be a diagonal line, but it can also be more complicated. And so, one of the arguments that I've seen in the past was that, like, humans may have just a sort of a subconscious reaction to certain shapes of certain animals. So to give you an example, like cockroaches. I've been thinking a lot about, like, why I think that mood and emotion is one of the most critical aspects of human consciousness that doesn't get enough attention, is that, we have these visceral reactions. Our visceral reactions are, like, probably the most important reactions that drive everything we do. And, through our evolution, we have a region of the brain called the Insular Cortex that becomes activated. Evolutionarily, it became activated when you smelled something rotten flesh, or feces, or vomits. These odors that are just repulsive to essentially everybody, right? You don't have to learn that, like, you shouldn't eat rotten food, right? It just happens, right? You just know that this smells terrible, and that's because large reason is because the insular cortex, a certain part of the brain, reacts to those sensory experiences. And I suspect that when it comes, and so cockroaches tend to be present in areas where there is potentially dangerous pathogens present, right? Rotting food, right? These types of things that you would never want to consume, right? And so, the argument would be that the reason that and cockroaches are completely harmless, right? I mean, they can potentially transmit diseases and stuff like that, but, like, they don't bite you, they can't hurt you, right? But even thinking about them right now is making my skin crawl, like, and so I suspect I would call that an instinct, right? Chocolate covered cockroaches, no thank you. I would call that an instinct, right? Because over millions of years, right, organisms, animals, and then primates and so on that cannot consume rotten food tended to constantly see these types of insects around rotten food or feces or blah, blah, blah. And so, millions of years sculpted this visceral reaction to seeing that and wanting to get away from it. I would call that an instinct. And so, I could go on and on, right? Like, another one, like, just think about, like, the English language, right? I think most of us are familiar with it. The words that we use to describe human behavior, right? That behavior was vile. That behavior was disgusting, was nauseating. These are literally visceral words describing the states of the viscera, right? And so, we're applying this ancient machinery from our brain, essentially the insular cortex, to something far more complicated and abstract, which is human behavior. And so yeah, I would argue that we do have instincts, in short. But okay, so it looks like we're connected. Dimitri, is that your name? And if so, where are you calling from?
Yeah, California.
Cool.
Let me ask you, Ian. So I've had major concussions, like 3 of them this year.
Wow.
And I had a seizure.
Oh.
Let me ask you something. And I noticed my emotional state, and I noticed I have short-term memory. How do you deal with it?
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, concussions are no joke, and having 3 of them is certainly it's non-trivial. So right now, well, so what are we talking about here, right? What is a concussion? A concussion is basically what happens when the brain has physically moved through, within the skull, bounced up against the side of it, And because the brain is essentially like jelly, or like a jello, right? It's almost like a fluid almost, right? Pressure waves travel through the brain, sort of like if you could just imagine like shaking a dome of jello, it'll sort of jiggle. That those waves propagate through the brain, and depending upon the severity or the force of that acceleration, those waves of movement can rupture connections between neurons, or it can literally damage neurons, kill neurons. And generally speaking, the greater the harder the hit, or the faster the acceleration, the greater the severity of that damage that occurs. And so generally speaking, if the damage, and there's no way to really know this for sure unless they did an MRI or something like that, and physicians have seen like areas of actual damage. But if it is just those connections between neurons, it'll take a while, but you can recover from that. Those connections can grow back, but it'll just take some time. But if neurons are lost, generally speaking, those neurons are not going to be coming back. And so that doesn't mean that you can't recover from it. It just means that the recovery process is going to be different. It's probably going to be longer in duration, and would likely involve some form of targeted therapy. I would imagine, and I'm not a physician, I'm a scientist, right? But I would imagine if you've experienced seizures, then these concussions were non-trivial, and so the recovery from concussions can be very complicated. It's not as simple as like a recovery from like let's say an arm injury or something like that, where you do sort of physical therapy and you do kind of progressive resistance training, these types of things. When it comes to concussion recovery, that's not always what you want to do. Sometimes the recovery process can be extended by like giving people cognitive challenges and stuff like that, sort of exercising the muscle, right? And so the recovery can be complicated, but the recovery will be composed of some form of therapy, and it might go on for weeks and weeks, months and months. It's hard to say, but that's basically what the therapy process is going to look like. I'm sorry to say, Dimitri.
Yeah, no, I spoke to a neurologist about it, and I told him straight up, because I get checked on, because of my work and what I do, every 2 weeks I have to take COVID tests. So I was talking to a neurologist, and he was telling me, like, you'll recover, but it's a long process, is what he was telling me. And I've taken certain things, like it's called Alpha Brain. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Yep.
It's from on it, yeah. So I've been taking stuff like that. I take this thing that's called Focus pills. I've been taking all kinds of things because I do notice one thing. Like, I'll be watching something that I like to watch, like as in like MMA.
Yeah.
I also participate in a gym where I do kickboxing, Muay Thai.
Yeah.
And I'll watch a fight, and out of nowhere I'll tear up just from like a crazy fight, and it's the weirdest thing because like I notice myself, it catch me. I've never been that way.
Yeah.
And another thing is like sometimes I forget my words. Like I'll be talking to someone and I can't remember what I want to say, and it's really weird because it's just recently happened. And granted, I haven't had a seizure since May, so I'm pretty fine. But I did get 2 concussions in one day from playing. I play soccer for a living, and I got kicked in the head the first time. They take me out for 10 minutes, and then I came back in, and I got a header and got it again. And this time they took me. The ambulance came. I didn't even remember anything.
Yeah.
And I woke up like in the ambulance, panicking.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's the reason why I was asking you those questions.
Yeah, Dimitri, I mean, so when I was in high school, I played football, and I got 2 concussions in one game as well. Essentially the same thing happened where I was, believe it or not, I was a running back, and then we had a terrible offensive line, and I got clotheslined and taken off the field. It was just, we were playing against a team we had no business playing. And I almost certainly had a concussion at that point, but then I was put back in the game and I got clotheslined again because we had a terrible offensive line. And same reaction that you're describing, where it was like I was a goldfish. It was like, usually when I just sort of came to on the bench, sitting there, didn't even know how I got there. And, if you imagine memory, where it's like starting from this moment, you just begin forming, memories, and you have an index of all the things that happened. For me, it was like my memory was going like this. It was just moment to moment. I forgot like what I was doing, looking at a scoreboard, all this kind of stuff. So I recovered. I was an adolescent, and so the brain is different. Well, I guess I don't know how old you are. Are you in like your 20s?
No, I'm 34.
34. Okay. Yeah. I mean, so obviously our brains are pretty different in how these things came about, but I recovered reasonably well, right? I never.
Like when I was in the hospital, because I spent 10 days there after the seizure.
Wow.
Like it was the weirdest thing. Like I would try to get up and walk, and I couldn't do it. Like I would just fall.
Wow.
It was the craziest thing. I had to have a walker.
Wow.
For a couple days. I recovered very quick, but I mean it was crazy to me because I'm very alert and logical sensible about things, and like I couldn't understand, like my body did not want to work with me.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So was it because you were dizzy, or your muscles wouldn't respond?
No, my body just didn't respond at all.
Wow.
Like I would seriously, like, it was almost like being like you're really drunk in a way.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Jeez, man. Well, I mean, I'm glad that you recovered from that. And it's going to be the case where it's just going to take a while. I mean, number one thing, if I were in your shoes, right, is I would totally withdraw from any high likelihood of being, getting another concussion. Because, part of the way these things work is, first of all, like when you have a concussion, like in the short period afterwards, you're more vulnerable to having another concussion. But then also, as you have more concussions, they accumulate. It's not like you recover from this one and you're back to baseline. It's like you have one and you recover, but you're still a little bit, you're not 100%. You have another one, and then that baseline goes up, and then you have another one, right? You see what I'm saying? They accumulate in severity. And so, that would be number one for me. And obviously it's going to be very difficult for you if since you play soccer professionally. But yeah, that just at least for the short term, until you feel like, you're back to something that feels like normal. And hopefully, your team will be able to work with you on that. But yeah, it's just going to take time, man. I'm sorry to say.
No, I'll tell you this, like, I've already been told don't do headers, which I haven't been. Mm-hmm. Right now we're in a the end of the season where I don't really play, but I still train.
Yeah.
But I don't do certain things. But I'll tell you this, I'm very aggressive. I'm very like I don't want to stop. It's my love. But I will say that I've noticed things, and I'm trying to be alert about it because when I was talking to the neurologist who came in to check on me, I've done 3 MRIs and 2 CTE scans,
mm-hmm.
and luckily they say I don't have it, so that's a good thing, because what they were scared about is that I might have what do you call it?
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Yeah, but no, where you can have there's my short-term memory, where you can have pressure in the brain.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Sure.
Yeah, so they were scared about that, and luckily I didn't have it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and then the other thing you brought up, that's good. The other thing you brought up was you seem to experience like these weird sort of emotional reactions in conditions where they normally wouldn't elicit those things. That's very common. That people become just highly emotionally reactive, and part of the reason that is, and that's also why, you know, you'll hear these stories of like professional football players who, you know, they're regularly getting concussions, right? Or certainly, you know, subconcussive traumatic brain injuries, right? But that's why you'll hear, you know, these stories of these insanely violent events that occur because that emotional reactivity is they've lost a component of the ability to suppress those emotional reactions. It certainly is not always, by and large, it's not going to result in some kind of hyper-aggressive, you know, reaction. But it can just result in this sort of lack of inhibition of emotional reactivity. And the reason for that, generally speaking, is that a region of the front of the brain, just think of it as the frontal lobe, sends inhibitory signals to other parts of the brain that are further towards the back. You know, the limbic system is what it's called, that regulate your mood. And generally speaking, that connection will just sort of turn down the volume a bit on emotional reactivity. And generally speaking, it's possible that after a concussion, some of that inhibition, some of that connection is lost or it's reduced. And so all of a sudden you'll experience this like emotional reaction to, you know, something that's meaningful, so, you know, something that is emotionally relevant, but the reaction is just so much higher because that turning down of the volume isn't quite as effective. Doesn't mean it's gone forever though. So it's good that you are acknowledging this, that you're aware of this, so that you know that when it happens, oh, that's what's happening, right? So at least you're not just completely passive and just at the whim of this thing. But you know, hopefully over time, those capabilities will develop a bit more just over time.
Yeah, I'll tell you this. Like, I'm very alert and I'm very aware. Because, like, I've been reading a lot about the brain, you know? Because the brain's amazing. And,
I agree.
I'm glad that I'm able to talk to you because I know you know a lot about the brain. That's why I'm talking to you now. It's crazy how much we don't know about it.
Yeah.
Because the brain can do more things.
No kidding.
And
I mean,
at the same time, like, you know, like I told you, like I would watch like an amazing video. Normally, I would never tear up, never. And all of a sudden, I will just tear up. And right. I noticed that, and I was like, "That's so weird. Like, why am I like, you know, why is that happening?" Is what I'm trying to say.
Yep.
It's crazy.
Yeah, that's largely why. And the state of the science when it comes to treatments for TBIs is, you know, there's just room for improvement. I'll put it that way. And there's a lot of really interesting studies going on to, first of all, prevent traumatic brain injuries and concussions, but then also treat them. And you know that they will become available eventually. And you know you're about my age, so we'll hopefully both be around to see them when they do. But listen, man. Thanks for calling in, Dimitri, and best of luck with your recovery. And you know, I hope you'll call back in at some point and let us know how you're doing.
Yeah, I appreciate talking to you. So yeah, thanks for letting me call in.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. I'll talk to you again soon.
All right,
bye.
Have a good night.
You too. Man. Okay. Do you think the COVID vaccine will have any effect on the brain? Well, it will, right? Not the vaccine itself, but it'll help to prevent the effects of COVID-19, SARS coronavirus 2 on the brain, right? So the past few weeks on YouTube, I've talked about some of the evidence that SARS coronavirus 2, the new, or the virus that causes COVID-19, has some effect, some capability. Part of the virus seems to be able to pass the blood-brain barrier to get into the brain. Number one. That was the first sort of solid bit of evidence. Well, there's other evidence too. Like in the past, the initial SARS outbreak, which was caused by SARS coronavirus 1, those viral particles were discovered in the nervous systems upon autopsy of people who had passed away in China, suggesting that it might be possible that virus gained access to the central nervous system. That was like the early evidence. Then we saw that a part of the spike protein could be detected in the brain, you know, by passing the blood-brain barrier, suggesting that at least part of the virus is able to get into the brain. And then the most recent two that I discussed on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, demonstrate that SARS coronavirus 2 is capable of infecting neurons, and they were using organoids, which is sort of more similar to the brain than just, neurons in a petri dish. So it can infect neurons, and then it can also infect a certain type of other brain cell called astrocytes, suggesting that if the virus can get into the brain, it can damage the brain. And the initial study that I brought up suggested that I think I've talked about 3 different studies that have looked into this, and one of them suggested that the damage induced by SARS coronavirus 2, COVID-19, it does result in the death of neurons, and it looks almost like somebody's had a stroke, where there are just sort of like these regions of neurons that undergo apoptosis. That's the real way you pronounce that word, believe it or not. You might have heard of apoptosis. You're not supposed to pronounce that P. It's apoptosis. It's a Greek word. But anyways, neurons have undergone apoptosis. They've undergone death, cell death. And it almost looks as though what it looks like when somebody has an ischemic stroke, when somebody has a deprivation of blood delivery to a certain part of the brain and neurons begin to die. That's what it looked like. And they have some really interesting explanations for why that might be the case. But yeah, so this is not a virus you want to catch. That doesn't seem to happen in everybody. Hell, there are plenty of people who totally asymptomatic. They didn't even know they had it. I might have had it at some point. But there definitely is a non-trivial percentage of people who have not only very, very severe reactions to it, but neurological symptoms, right? They have strokes, or they have, symptoms of dementia, confusion, dizziness, obviously headaches is one of them. Anosmia, the loss of the ability to smell. I have it currently. Why does it affect taste and smell? Amazing timing, Louis. Well, I'm happy to so if you want a deeper dive into that topic, you can check out my YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, or you can tap whatever, the link on my profile page here on Periscope. But the short answer is, so to tie that in a bow, SARS coronavirus 2 has the potential to affect the brain directly or indirectly, for sure. We don't know specifically what the mechanism is, and so will any of these vaccines affect the brain? The answer is yes, certainly yes, in one way, and that is preventing that virus, preventing there from being enough viral particles that replicate in your body that some of them will get into the brain and then cause all kinds of long-lasting neurological symptoms. So how does it affect smell? That was one of the first stories that, when it became validated that people were losing the sense of smell, and in some cases also taste, my first reaction was just like, their noses are stuffed up. I've had a cold, probably from another coronavirus. I've had the flu, and obviously my nose gets stuffed up, and I'll take a medication to clear that out. I don't recommend taking it, like Afrin. Don't take that medication. But it cleared me right up, but I still, my sense of smell was still kind of damaged. And it was almost certainly because of the effect of either the Afrin or the virus, whatever virus it was. So I assume that's what it was, right? It was just, some inflammation, maybe, it's just sort of interfering with the ability of olfactory receptors from binding olfactory odorants, right? The literal mechanism of smell, the chemoreception. However, once the story of this anosmia, the loss of the sense of smell, became sort of validated that this was a real thing, this was unique to COVID-19, then it became a more serious story. And so there are a couple different potential explanations. One explanation is that, we know that COVID-19 causes this very severe inflammatory reaction in some people. You might have heard of cytokine storm. That is the immune system essentially like carpet bombing the body. It's just, it's sending out all these inflammatory cytokines, it's essentially like, it's like, it's a part of your innate immune system, right? And so your innate immune system is sort of like a police force in a city, right? Whereas your secondary acquired immunity, your B cells and T cells, are more like Navy SEALs, right? They're more like highly trained, very specifically focused on one particular task. And so a cytokine storm is sort of like if the police just started randomly throwing, shooting off their guns like randomly in a city, just in the hopes that they would catch the person they're trying to catch, right? That's sort of like what can happen in some of these cases where people have these cytokine storms. Their immune system is just going nuts. And so one mechanism by which the loss of smell might occur is through that inflammation, through that runaway immune system response, literally damaging the nervous system components of the ironically the body kills itself, exactly, literally damaging parts of the nervous system that are needed for the sense of smell. So it could be that, right? We know that when tested for like where the viral particles tend to accumulate, where the greatest concentration of SARS coronavirus 2 particles is after an organism is exposed to it through the air, like how you're normally exposed to it, by far it's the olfactory system. It's the nasal cavity, which makes sense, right? Because it's largely a respiratory virus, and so you're breathing it in, so it just makes sense that they would accumulate and propagate the most right there. But then they can be found in essentially every other organ system, which is kind of crazy. Anyways, so it could also be a direct effect, a direct consequence of the virus infecting those sensory neurons that are necessary for transducing that chemical signal, transducing, I smell bacon, right? Because literally molecules from the bacon are floating through the air and then binding a receptor in your nose. Kind of crazy if you think about it, an olfactory receptor, and then that triggers an event in the olfactory nervous system, and then you recognize, this is bacon. So, it could be that. It could also be a little bit more higher order, right? It might be that the virus does indeed bypass the blood-brain barrier and then literally infect a bunch of neurons that are involved in the olfactory cortex, essentially, like the highest level neurons in that whole pathway that enables you to like do things like recognize bacon or distinguish, this bacon is overcooked, this bacon is undercooked, this is turkey bacon, this is pork bacon, or whatever you call it. And so it could be all of those things. And if you want an even deeper dive than that, you can check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/anthropoid. And I have a link to it in my Periscope profile page. Will you be taking the vaccine? Yes, as soon as I possibly can. As soon as I possibly can. So doctors have to screen for more diseases after COVID-19 when there is no apparent diagnosis. Have to screen for more diseases after COVID-19. Yeah. I think that's going to be that's a really important point. I think it's going to be an issue for our healthcare system, is that we don't know what the long-term consequences of having a severe reaction to COVID-19 is. Hell, we don't know what the long-term consequences of a child being infected with the virus. We know they don't respond nearly as severely as adults, not even close, but they can still get infected. And so could there be long-term consequences where we just we won't know until they're 10 years older, right? But beyond that, when it comes to people my age, we're not young and scrappy anymore, right? We're in our 30s, and then older. I'll hopefully, knock on wood, be around for a bit longer. And so we don't know what the long-term consequences of somebody like me who might respond severely to COVID-19, less likely than somebody over the age of 65, but still, it definitely happens. We don't know what the long-term consequences of that. The long-term, most notably would be lungs, like, damage to the lungs. Who knows what the long-term consequences of that will be. I am vet, now motivated to get shot. Thanks. Yeah. To get shot? To get, hopefully, the vaccine. I hope. Don't know if you talked about it before. So this is on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. In your science advisor role, what are you most motivated to promote, push for, create awareness about? Well, so there's a lot. So I am largely working with the legislature, and so it's just a ton of different bills. So much gets done at the state level. It's kind of shocking. Like almost nothing gets done by the federal, legislature anymore. Like, it does obviously, but like dozens and dozens and dozens of bills get passed by the legislature. And so, everything from making naloxone more widely available, that's sort of opioid overdose antidote, to, changing the way that long-term care facilities, which is, like places like nursing homes, how they're monitored, how they're surveyed, how they're regulated. We know that in the United States, an incredibly disproportionate number of people have died from COVID-19 have been in long-term care facilities, nursing homes, assisted living, these types of places. And so, something needs to change. And it's not like that surprising, right? It's tragic and it's unsurprising because we know that pathogens circulate through long-term care facilities quite a bit. Anyway, so, modifying that, coming up with more coherent plans in response to a pandemic than, having to rely on the federal government doing it all. I mean, the federal government should have been way, way better than it was. But, the state has world-class research institutions, some of the world-leading experts in, coming up with a field that leverages all of those assets. And I could go on and on, but that's sort of what it is. And my motivation is to elevate the volume of the voice of somebody with a background in science in these conversations. So it's not only lawyers, it's not only, real estate brokers and stuff like that, or I'm just saying that because those are like the main industries in the state. There's nothing wrong with either of those professions, but or even physicians. Not that there are that many in any legislatures, but physicians aren't scientists, and so that's my motivation, is to bring that expertise to the table, so that these conversations that occur as legislation is being crafted are informed by a scientific background. Who said that vaccines will help us to protect us and there will be long-term consequences? Oh, wait. Did you bring something up earlier? Well, so the thing is, with the long-term consequences concern, generally speaking, over the history of vaccines, if there is going to be a long-term consequence of a vaccine, generally speaking, you see it certainly within 2 months, but generally even more rapidly than that, right? Because the immune system is reacting. The immune system is going to react, right? And if it doesn't react, then it's a bunk vaccine, right? Then you're not getting what you want out of it. And so, that's why, generally speaking, if you're not seeing any consequence, any severe side effects by 2 months, it's just vanishingly unlikely that something all of a sudden is going to happen. Now, people will have side effects. I mean, that's true for literally every single medical treatment you can name. Every single one. Tylenol has, pretty deleterious side effects. It's certainly in some people. Name any medication, and there are, costs and benefits. And so one of the costs of waiting for, let's say, another 5 years to approve these vaccines would be millions of people would die from this virus. Millions of people. Your parents, your uncles, your parents-in-law, your mother-in-law, they'd all very likely, right? The magnitude of the suffering would be so severe, it's almost impossible to conceive of just how many people. It's impossible to conceive how many people have already been lost, right? Essentially 500,000 people. That is insane. That is a mind-bogglingly large number. And so, so given what we know about how vaccines operate, just over history, I mean, it's not like this is our first rodeo, it looked really, really good. The side effects were minimal, well tolerated by people, older citizens or participants. You got me thinking about government now. So that's the cost benefit, and I think I have been very critical of some of what the FDA, as a total dilettante out here in the state government, but I've been totally critical of how the FDA has handled almost every single decision throughout this whole thing. But this one, the way they've handled the vaccine, great, excellent. And it's not like this is just me speaking alone. Like that's the perspective of essentially all of the people who've devoted their lives to epidemiology, to virology, to developing vaccines. So this is a source of pride. This is a moment in this short history of ours where we can say we nailed this one. Like, this was good. So, okay. Is the new concern with ibuprofen legitimate or politically motivated? I'm not sure which one you mean by what concern you're highlighting about ibuprofen. I know early on during the pandemic in France, there was a physician who basically put out a memo saying, like, I think that there's something that ibuprofen has some kind of unique detrimental interaction with COVID-19. And, so you can sort of, biologically, like, you can sort of get to understanding why that might happen. just in terms of, how ibuprofen influences inflammation, and of course there's a pathogen to which we have an inflammatory response and everything, so you can sort of understand why that might be the case. And ibuprofen, acetaminophen, aspirin, or salicylic acid, whatever, naproxen sodium, these are all different molecules. They accomplish very similar things, but they're different molecules, so you could imagine that there might be something unique, but ultimately it turned, there just wasn't any evidence. Like this was just, a complete speculation, which is valuable, but people took it and ran with it as though this were canon. And it's when we were all so hungry for information about what's going on and what's good for us to do, what's bad for us to do. And so as of now, and I can tell you what I did right after I saw that advice. I went out and bought some more Tylenol. I wouldn't, at this point, I wouldn't recommend, certainly going to a store, being surrounded by people just to get, something other than ibuprofen. But maybe you're talking about something else. Thank you, Daryl. I just saw that right before you got to it. Quick on the draw, Daryl. Okay, Q, for those who are fearful of the vaccine, is there anything besides a vax that could be used? The reality is no, right? Like the weapon we have in our arsenal against viruses, we only have one real weapon: vaccines. There are some treatments. Last week on YouTube, you can check this out on my YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. You can get to it via my profile on Periscope. I talked about a study that did explore the potential benefits of remdesivir in people who are predisposed or who have Alzheimer's disease. A specific subset of patients who have a form of the gene called ApoE4. This is if you inherit this form of the gene, you're much more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease and much more likely to develop it much more rapidly. And there seems to be some unique interaction between this virus and not like this specific protein necessarily, but the sort of landscape, the environment that having that gene sculpts within your brain. Remdesivir is it's not a vaccine, obviously, and it's also not an antibody, right? It's not like the monoclonal antibody cocktail, the polyclonal cocktail of antibodies that Donald Trump was given. Donald Trump was also given remdesivir. So this is just an antiviral molecule that basically what it does is it interferes with the ability of viruses, certain kinds of viruses, to replicate themselves. And so, at the right time, it can be useful. But you can't just be on remdesivir for the rest of your life, right? And you can't be on it for as long as it's going to take for everybody else to do you the favor of getting the vaccine. I'm not saying that this for you, but to do somebody who's hesitant or resistant to getting the vaccine, do them the favor of getting the vaccine, dealing with the muscle soreness, dealing with the headaches that can happen, right? Because the immune system is reacting. That's a sign that the immune system is responding as it should. But then you get to benefit from the herd immunity that arises, right? But that's essentially the only other one. I know dexamethasone has been effective in some cases. Dexamethasone is essentially, it's almost like hydrocortisone. It's almost like cortisol. It just suppresses inflammatory responses in general. So that is doing nothing with regards to amping up your ability to fight off the virus. At least remdesivir would restrict the speed at which viral particles can replicate, right, by interfering with its replication process with RNA polymerase. Dexamethasone is just suppressing your immune system. Is basically what it's doing, and so that's if that is the weapon that you're going to choose, then that's not particularly effective. But listen, I appreciate that anybody who's willing to talk to somebody who's resistant. Obviously you can tell for me, my first response is just making it abundantly clear that I'm going to take this vaccine as soon as I can. My parents have taken it, and I almost started crying when they told me. It's happening. Like the relief that I had when I learned that my parents got just the first dose. They're getting their second one in just a couple days. 4 days? The relief is just, it's hard to explain, so
that's what I would focus on. And I would just appeal to their emotions, that this, your concern is justifiable, and it is intuitive, and it makes sense, and I get you, and I get being skeptical of biomedical science in general, skeptical of medicine and physicians, even vaccines. I totally get that. But, this is the thing that will protect your children from the horror of losing their parents or their grandparents, or their uncles, or, people who would enrich their lives, people who would raise them. This is the thing. It's not any other medical treatment. It's not an herb. It's not some kind of essential oil. It's nothing like that is going to do it. This is the thing. That's what I would appeal to. It's just that emotional, that visceral connection. And it's true. It's not like you're exaggerating. Like, that is 100% true. Do you want to know your car's extended warranty is about to expire? Call immediately to protect your car. Well, thank you. I'll keep that in mind. I appreciate your attention. Is the next vaccine coming up built different? Yeah. So the first two vaccines that were generated in the United States were what are called mRNA vaccines. So these are basically, it's fairly simple actually, but these are basically the, mRNA is, generally speaking, when something is made in the body, it starts out as DNA in your genome. It is then transcribed into RNA. And then that RNA is translated into amino acids that become proteins. Okay, and so these mRNA vaccines are starting in this middle stage right here. Not DNA, it's RNA. And they're basically, it's just that RNA enclosed in these little fatty water balloons, lipid nanoparticles, that then essentially gain access to the cells in your shoulder muscle, right? And then those cells will will translate that RNA into protein. Right, and the protein in this case is just the spike protein from the virus, from at least one of the viruses, and your immune system then recognizes that that protein as foreign, and then ultimately generates antibodies against it. And then anytime, it's sort of like you're trying to you're running a surveillance operation in a mall or something like that, and you're trying to find a person who stole an iPhone or whatever. I don't know. Who cares? And the only information you have is, you don't know exactly what the guy looks like, but you know that he's wearing a green hat, right? And so you can, anytime, or an even more unique bit of clothing, like, a scarf that has like, the Joker's face on it, a bunch or something like that. Something really unique, right? That's all you know, but suddenly you see, hey, there's a dude with the Joker thing, with the Joker scarf, get him. That's sort of what we're talking about here, where, the immune system learns to recognize that spike protein and then generates antibodies against it. Okay, so those are the first ones. Brilliant, brilliant work. This is a byproduct of years of investment in basic biomedical research, and actually some of which happened right here at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, there are, some advantages to doing it that way as opposed to the traditional way being getting some of the virus itself and then inactivating them, exposing them to heat, or irradiating them so that they're no longer alive, they're no longer active, but there's still enough components of the viruses that your immune system is exposed to different parts of the virus. There are some advantages to that, almost certainly, but it's slower. And of course, there's always the possibility that there's a inactivated viral particle in there, right? And it's certainly better than the old school version of vaccination that they used to do for smallpox, where they would literally just infect you. They would just take a very, very small inoculum, is what they called it, and infect you with it. And because the dose of virus was low enough, it didn't kill you. So it's better than that, right? Hello, Diamond Trucker Girl. Okay. So, but of course, the difficulties are that, and we should know that both of the mRNA vaccines induce a very, very, very effective immune response. And, the difficulties are that they need to be kept pretty cold. Pfizer one a little bit colder, although it might be just fine. It might do okay at the same temperatures as the Mrna. Mrna, I think, is at -20, which is essentially like a freezer. Whereas the Pfizer one needs like really, really cold freezers. So that's difficult, but who cares? They're super effective. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is different. It is essentially a modified virus, a innocuous virus. I think that must be like the actual use of that term. Anyways, it is a modified chimpanzee adenovirus, ChAd-Ox. So it's basically just like fighting fire with fire. Like, you have your virus, well, we have our buddy viruses that are going to help us to recognize you and then fight you off. That's essentially the strategy. It's actually the same, and so you get 2 doses of that ChAd-Ox vaccine. It's actually a similar strategy to the Sputnik vaccine. I can't remember what they're calling it, but Sputnik, that's the new Russian vaccine. Similar to their strategy, but what they've done is instead of having 2 doses of the same modified virus, you get 2 slightly different viruses in the vaccine. Just, interesting. It was something that, I discussed with other scientists in the past, and it seems to be rather effective and versatile. Okay. There are other strategies, though. There is, for example, I think it's Novavax they're essentially producing protein from the virus, or that the virus would produce in insect cells, and then introducing those proteins along with adjuvants to initiate an immune response to those proteins. I can't remember if that's Novavax or if that's a different one. I know that I think the Chinese vaccine is like a traditional vaccine. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like it has as high of efficacy as some of these newer strategies, technologies, or vaccines. So, but anyways, yeah, there's a bunch of different coals in the fire, which is excellent. Another advantage of the mRNA strategy is that you can change it. You can change the sequence of that mRNA in an afternoon, right? Once you know, like, so if a new strain arises, like in the South Africa strain, or I think there's actually 2 strains in new strains in Kent, or in the United Kingdom. All you have to do is just change the sequence of the mRNA that you're producing, and you have a more effective vaccine. That's also true for the Oxford AstraZeneca strategy. You just have to modify the virus. It's probably a little bit more laborious, but not that much. So you can be very, very nimble. So we're going to have different strategies, but if anybody is wondering, like, oh, well, should I wait until I can get this vaccine or that one? Don't think about it that way. These are all very, very effective, so, like, shockingly effective. Give you a sense of how effective. The threshold that the FDA was going to consider for efficacy to approve these vaccines was like 50%. I think that's what the WHO, that's their threshold. And it just means that, like, it's pretty effective. It's not very effective, but it's pretty effective. We're talking about with these new 2 vaccines in the United States, but then also with the Oxford AstraZeneca one, and I think also the Novavax one. We're talking efficacies like either above 90%, which is wild. It's so good, or maybe a little bit lower in some cases, or and that's amazing. So it doesn't matter which one you get. Just get it. That's the thing to worry about. Hello, Diamond Trucker Girl. How are you? Why is no one teaching a natural way of building immune systems? What do you mean, no one? I mean, I've never heard anybody say, don't take care of yourself. Like, there's so much, like, I just see all these guys on and they're almost exclusively guys on YouTube, like decrying that we're not spending enough time talking about other things that don't have to do with the vaccine. Well, the reason is that not everybody has a healthy immune system, and the vaccine is the most effective thing that will save all of us from this virus. So that's why. But yeah, I mean, people talk about the importance of, competent diet, about getting enough sleep. Certainly if you have comorbidities, that becomes extremely important. And then you have, people talking about vitamin D a lot, and people even talking about, like, using, like, Listerine. Like, there's some interest in the possibility of components of basically mouthwash, not necessarily Listerine, but mouthwash, to be effective, to be like just another source of mitigation of the severity of the virus. So, I mean, I think people are talking about a lot of different things. I mean, of all the things that you can criticize about the government's response to COVID-19, the scientific community, I would argue, doesn't really warrant it. There were some mistakes that were made early on in the medical community, but yeah, I would say that this is like, this is a source of pride, and certainly in science in the United States, but also internationally. There's unprecedented collaboration, interaction, communication between scientists in all over the world, unprecedented. So like I'll see people who have like millions of followers on YouTube saying like, why aren't people talking about vitamin D? Well, you're talking about vitamin D. You're not technically a scientist, but I mean, people are talking about it. Like, how do you know about it, right? People did a study. So I don't know, it strikes me as like just being a non sequitur. Like, it's unrelated, right? Like, people are talking about it, and it's just not as effective as the vaccine. That's why. All right, I hear you all. How can I activate both sides of my brain? Here's a short one. You have no choice. They are both going to be active no matter what you're doing. There are some rare exceptions of processes that are somewhat lateralized, like language, a little bit lateralized, a little bit more left hemisphere dominant. But no matter what you're doing, whether you're doing math, painting art, speaking a sentence, reading a book, both hemispheres are active. And if your question is, how do I become more proficient or develop better expertise, be more effective at any given thing? If your question is, if I were to activate both hemispheres of my brain, I would be better at pretty much everything. That's just not the case, right? The question isn't how much of your brain is active. The question is what parts of your brain are active. And generally speaking, more activation is going to be associated with inferior performance because you're going to be, distracted by unnecessary activities. Okay. What will be with a person if we only have I'm guessing one half of the brain, one hemisphere of the brain? There is such a thing. There's a video that you can watch of a young girl who had to have a hemispherectomy because she had very severe epilepsy, life-threatening, and so she essentially only has one hemisphere of her brain, and she, you can tell that there's something different. Like, there's something a little bit different. I mean, also she's still quite young. Her brain is developing. And I can be both cerebral and painting. Yeah, exactly. Totally. Good instinct there. And so you can, right, like, you can tell that there's something a little bit different, but it's remarkable. She's pretty much fine. She's just sitting there. She's responding in conversation. I think she was interviewed by like Oprah or Ellen or something, responding in conversation. It's totally impressive. And that's because our brain is largely bilateral, largely symmetrical. You have a hippocampus on this side of the brain and one on this side of the brain, literally in that shape. You have an amygdala here and an amygdala here. Almost all brain regions have, two bilaterally. But there's a few exceptions. I studied one of those exceptions that are not bilateral and are not symmetrical. But that's why. So, you still have one hippocampus left if you lose one hemisphere. All right, I should call it a day so that people can celebrate the national religious experience that is the Super Bowl. And hopefully I will see you again at the sometime this week, or if not, hopefully next Sunday. Same time, same place. See you there. Have a great week, everybody. All right, thanks everybody for hanging out on YouTube. I appreciate it as always. If you haven't subscribed and you're interested in doing so, I hope you'll remember to do so. Yeah. Oh, good to see you, Craig. I was really bummed when you brought the second guy into the phone call last week that we didn't get to sit in on their very, very interesting conversation, especially because the second guy started to talk about the whole mosquito vaccination thing. Was he talking about it? Yeah, the platform crashed for me. That's what happened. So that was Abyss and Euromaestro. I'm probably going to be collaborating with Euromaestro a fair bit more frequently on the new platform, haps.tv, HAPPS, and then maybe also here on YouTube. He's a smart dude. Did you get the link that I sent? I don't think so. Oh, yes. Yeah, so I forgot that was you that brought that up. Yeah, okay, let's talk about that before we close out. So, well, I guess I don't know if I got it from you, but I did find, I don't think I did actually, but I did find an article on mosquitoes indeed being genetically engineered, but in a specific way. right? So there are a couple examples of this, like the suicide mosquitoes that have been genetically engineered to essentially be incapable of reproducing. There was that, and then what was the mechanism? It was something like, it was like they were engineered. They were genetically engineered, mosquitoes, right, to essentially have a pathway within their bodies that would immediately recognize a certain sequence of RNA and then digest it and destroy it. So it's sort of like an immune system. It's not identical. It's not like B cells and T cells and all that kind of stuff. These are tiny little organisms, but it's basically a genetic immune system, because of course viruses are just genetic sequences, and so they have an immune system that would prevent those sequences from being around for long enough to replicate and then ultimately be transmitted. And so you could do that. I think they were doing it for malaria. No, I'm sorry. They were doing it for the Zika virus. But you could theoretically do it for essentially any virus, at least any RNA virus. All right, but if I'm missing it, if that's not what you're talking about, then I don't know why I just turned out both of these lights on. If that's not what you're talking about, then do me a favor and either put it in the discussion down below, like the comments down below, or you can email me at sweet. Yeah, there we go. So it's anthropoidemail@gmail.com. I would appreciate it. Sincerely, Craig. I would appreciate it. Yeah, thank you all. Yeah, so I will let you all go enjoy what I'm sure most normal humans are enjoying, which is watching the Super Bowl. Hope your team wins, which means I hope Tom Brady loses. Otherwise, thanks for watching, everybody, and thanks for your support. I will see you next week. Bye, everybody.